Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching Strategies to Support Self-Regulation Difficulties in Preschoolers. My name is Annie Klockner-Gonzalez. I'm a school psychologist, and I work at Fairfax County Public Schools in the Office of Early Childhood Assessment, and it's the Child Find Office. We have 3 of these offices in Fairfax County, and I'm looking forward to presenting what I've learned through my experiences, my years of working in Fairfax County, and as a school psychology, about over 20 years. So let's get into it. My presentation today has to do with self-regulation, how to support you as parents and teachers on how to be able to approach kids who have difficulties with self-regulation and perhaps provide you with a ton of resources where you can grab what works best for you. Let's talk about what self-regulation is. It's the ability to remain alert and calm enough in order to be available to engage, to interact, and learn with others. As you can see in this classroom, it's a busy classroom, but it would refer to our ability that we all have, and we have weaknesses and strength within this ability to be able to regulate my ability to pay attention given everything that's going on, my ability to regulate my emotions even though somebody might be fighting next to me or I may be anxious, and my ability to regulate my behavior, my wanting to do something or control that behavior so that I can remain engaged in learning and engage at home with my parents. There are 3 main areas for self-regulation skills. Those main areas would be attention, behavior, and emotions. And so through our talk, we're going to be looking at each of those 3 areas of self-regulation skills. Before we dive into the meat of self-regulation, I think it's important that we talk about 2 other areas that go hand in hand with self-regulation skills. One of them is executive functioning skills. You probably have heard about executive functioning skills. There's a lot of it outside in the literature and when you hear about kids' difficulties with self-regulation skills. But what is important to understand about executive functioning skills is that these are a set of mental skills that we use every day to learn to work and to manage our daily life. And when we think of self-regulation, and how they go hand in hand with executive functioning skills. As I talk about each of these skills, you'll see that self-regulation skills have something to do, and it complements itself with executive functioning skills. They don't happen independent of each other. When you look at information about executive functioning skills, you find some graphics online, and they tend to have a set of skills. Sometimes they seem a little bit different, sometimes they're the same. There's no real agreement as to how we call each of them and how many there are, but they're very similar. So I wouldn't get caught up in that this may seem a little different than the other. But this wheel, I think, really summarizes what executive functioning skills are, and I'll bring in how self-regulation skills relates to these characteristics. If we start, for example, with the emotional control piece, an executive functioning aspect is to be able to control my emotions as I'm experiencing my daily life. Am I able to control my anxiety? Am I able to control my anger or my happiness, my excitement? Another executive functioning skill would be initiation. When I start a task, I need to initiate it, and I need to be able to regulate myself to start that task. Sometimes I'm very excited and I have difficulties understanding where to start, or perhaps there's so many places where I can start a task or a project and I don't know where to start. So initiation is part of executive functioning skills. Self-monitoring skills has to do with the ability that I have as a preschool to be able to realize and look at my mistakes. That as I'm completing this paper or this drawing, or I'm doing this craft, or I'm building this piece of structure of Legos, Am I making mistakes? Am I fixing them? So I'm monitoring my skills and my performance as I'm building my structure of Legos. Shifting is very important because it's the ability to be able to talk to someone or play or be involved in a task, and being able to respond to, let's say that somebody needs my attention. So I look to Johnny, who is asking me a question. I'm going to shift. And then after that, I need to come back to my task. So the ability to shift attention, to shift behavior, it is an executive functioning skill, and it requires me also to have good self-regulation skills. Working memory, it's the ability to remember information in my mind for a short period of time, and be able to retell it. Self-regulation skills is important in that sense because I need to be able to sustain the attention, to be able to remember what I've been asked to remember, whether it's oral information or whether it's information that I'm seeing. So that short-term memory is very important. Planning and organization are other two areas, and they go hand in hand. When I plan a task, I need to be able to regulate my attention, my emotion, and my behavior, but I need to come up with certain tasks or steps, and I need to understand priorities. And as a preschooler, I can do that to a certain degree, but I need to be able to organize those thoughts. So that's where the organization come in, and organize those steps in order to be able to execute that task. And so again, I need to regulate my emotion, my behavior, and my attention to be able to do that. Sometimes you go and look for other pictures of executive functioning skills or the literature, and you find again that it's slightly different. But this other visual, I think it illustrates what some of the executive functioning skills are that are necessary for our functioning, to be able to engage in class or engage in activity at home. And you can see that when you look through these different descriptions, there's a need for my ability to regulate my emotions, my behaviors, and my attention. So let's talk a little bit about the first area of self-regulation skills that is very important. And it's the ability to regulate my attention as a preschooler. So imagine my child, it's in a classroom or it's at home, and I need to get them to perform a task, to solve a puzzle, to engage in play, for them to get dressed, or I'm in a classroom and I need them to be able to sustain attention to circle time, to be able to, when they do a craft, to follow my instructions, and to sustain and pay attention to the task they have in front of them. So what are those areas within the attention skills that are important for a preschooler to have? First of all is the ability to focus on the information while simultaneously a lot of things are going on around me that I need to ignore. So that's a skill within the ability to regulate attention. Another skill is to be able to sustain that focus of attention over time. So I'm not only needed to be able to obtain the attention, pay the attention, but to remain attentive to a certain amount of time. I also need to be able to shift attention to adapt to different demands. So for example, if I am in circle time in a preschool and I'm paying attention to the teacher, and all of a sudden the teacher, let's say, asks a question to Johnny, I'm going to shift attention to Johnny. Let's say I'm Danny, and Johnny answers with a good answer, and then the teacher continues. I need to shift that attention appropriately. So not only do I need to obtain attention, pay attention, I need to sustain attention, I need to shift. Also, as I'm learning all of this and I'm in circle time, I need to be able to encode information, to keep that information in my mind. And that's when I was talking about short-term memory and the ability to be able to maintain that information in my mind. For that, sometimes kids have difficulties with regulating the attention because they may be paying attention for a certain amount of time and might be able to shift it, but then all of a sudden they got distracted and then they're missing a piece of information, so then I can't remember what was it that I needed to remember. So working memory is impacted. In this organization, sometimes when we need to do a task or need to approach some kind of craft, we need to be organized in how we're going to approach that task. And for that, I need to be able to maintain attention and to regulate my attention, to maintain my organization of finishing a craft or constructing an interesting house with my blocks. Sometimes when kids have difficulties in finishing a task, that's a sign that they're having difficulties with their attention because they became distracted. And the last part of self-monitoring skills, as I am building my Lego structure, as I'm finishing my craft, as I am learning something from the teacher, I need to be able to monitor my own behavior, even as a preschooler, to realize, oh, wait, I'm off task. I need to pay attention to the teacher. Of course, I'm not going to say that, but all of a sudden that realization that the preschooler has that needs to shift the attention to the teacher, or I need to monitor if I made a mistake, I'm going to fix it. So those are very important skills when you are regulating your attention. Let's talk about the regulation of emotion. Regulation of emotions is not necessarily what I do, but rather the emotional experience. How emotionally charged do I feel based on the situation? So these visuals hopefully express that in the sense that sometimes I'm angry. All of us get angry, of course, but sometimes kids experience that anger to a degree that it's really hard to regulate that emotion, or they're very, very anxious, and it's really, really hard for them to control or regulate that feeling of anxiety. So again, it's how intense that physiological experience is when I am trying to regulate my emotions. The last area for self-regulation skills is the ability to regulate my behaviors. So this has to do with the expression of that perhaps emotion. It's what I do with my behavior. So it refers to the ability to manage the behavior and the reactions to feelings and things happening around the child. As a side note, throughout this presentation, I'm going to use the word emotions and feelings together to mean the same. But when you look at the literature, just keep in mind that emotions and feelings sometimes are referred to different things, because one is the physiological experience and the other one is more of a mental image or experience that we have. So we've reviewed what self-regulation skills are, and I've given you an idea of how they relate to executive functioning skills. The other area that is important to understand when we talk about self-regulation skills is what we call sensory sensitivities. It is important to understand sensory sensitivities as they may affect a child's ability to regulate themselves. And when we talk about sensory sensitivities, think about your senses. So think about your visual sense, your touch, your tactile sense, the sense of smell, the sense of taste, my auditory senses. How do I perceive noises? Another sense that is very important, it's called proprioceptive. It's your body awareness, if you're aware of your body in space. And another sense is the vestibular sense. It's the sense of balance. Sensory processing refers to the degree to which a child is aware of and reacts to various sensations. Some children have sensory modulation problems. So for example, they might be sensory seekers. They crave some kind of sensation, or they may be sensory avoiders. They can't stand it. I'll give you an example. All of us have sensory sensitivities. Some of us have strengths and weaknesses, and it's okay to have them. We all have them, as I said. But for example, sometimes these sensory sensitivities may affect my life or may affect something that I do. I personally don't like very loud noises or a very particular pitch. And so, for example, the humming of the bathroom fan kind of bothers me. And I certainly, what I do is I don't turn on that switch. But when it's on, it really bothers me. So I know I do have some kind of sensory auditory sensitivity, but I can regulate that and I can turn it off. For some children, it really may affect them. That they really need to avoid that high degree of sensory sensitivity to noises. They may cover their ears or they get very upset. And so they are avoiding that sensation. Some of the kids really seek sensation. So for example, they really enjoy movement. And they seek movement all the time, or they love to balance, or they seek pressure, or they seek certain textures or sensations. Or for example, they really like the soft texture of some toys. Again, it's important to understand these sensory sensitivities because it helps us sometimes adjust the environment for the children, or it helps us understand how we can manipulate some of the characteristics in the environment to promote their ability to attend. For example, there are some children that have texture sensitivity, or they really like to fiddle with things in their hands. And so sometimes what we can do is we can bring in some of these objects and they can fiddle when they're able to pay attention to the teacher. And actually this would promote their ability to pay better attention to the teacher. So that's an example of how sensory sensitivities can affect a child's behavior. Another types of difficulties with sensory sensitivity may be the ability that kids have with discriminating a sensation, and sometimes in coordinating these senses. So in understanding sensory sensitivities, there's two key questions I think that I would invite you to keep in mind when you're thinking of self-regulation skills. One key question would be, how much is the sensory problem impacting the regulation of attention, the experience of emotions, and expression of behaviors? And another question that I think it's important to keep in mind is, to what degree does addressing a sensory need support the student's access to educational activities? I'll give you an example. If a child has a lot of difficulties with auditory stimuli, so they get easily overwhelmed, they can manage themselves in the classroom, perhaps because the classroom could be quiet, or it's calm enough. But in going to the cafeteria, I know that this child in particular may have sensory sensitivities to sound, and the echo in the cafeteria sometimes is hard. So perhaps I would prepare the child, or perhaps I would accommodate in one way or another, but I'll be ready for him to become deregulated when they go to the cafeteria. So not only it helps for adults to be aware, I will work with the child for the child to be able to tell me or understand how we may prepare ourselves to regulate ourselves when we may be going into the cafeteria. So again, is how to understand that child's sensory sensitivities to help the teachers and the parents adjust the environment, not to a degree I think that it's super restrictive, but just to be able to understand and come to some kind of an easing the adjustment of the child. Here are some really good resources that I have found if you're interested in learning more about sensory issues and self-regulation skills, because I don't think that this is that you can click on my presentation once you get to see it on YouTube, but you'll be able to see, and then you can do a search on Google. But understanding sensory issues and anxiety, they really go hand in hand. And anxiety is a difficulty with self-regulation of emotion. So that's a good article. The outofsyncchild.com, it's actually a book. You can purchase the book. It's at the Parent Resource Center. But this website, it's a really good website. It comes from the work from Dr. Ayers, which is the next resource there. And it is, I like the way the book explains how sensory sensitivities can affect a child's behavior. And it also has a lot of strategies on how to perhaps adjust the environment or try to support your child with these sensory sensitivities. Also, there is the sensory disorders and ADHD. I found that this to be a good article. Adhd magazine, it's actually a good tool to learn a lot about ADHD, and self-regulation goes hand in hand also with ADHD. So when we talk about strategies to approach self-regulation skills, one of the things that I have learned through my practice and, of course, in reading lots of resources is that it's easier, and it's easier for the child, it's easier for us as adults when we approach some strategies through a hierarchical order. So if we're going to teach the child to be able to regulate themselves in all areas, we want to make sure that they have this skill, which would be they have an appropriate emotional repertoire before they can learn how to apply a calming technique or to calm down, because they need to recognize what they're feeling before they know what to do. They can know what to do. So refer to this list of things, which I'm going to present next, on perhaps how we can support our kids, preschoolers, in practicing more appropriate self-regulation skills. The very first one is the ability to expand a child's emotional repertoire. So a child needs to be able to identify emotions, and we also need to keep in mind the developmental expectations of identifying emotions. So if I'm talking about a 2-year-old, 2 to 3-year-old, for example, I would expect him to get happy, sad, and mad or angry, but I wouldn't expect them to get more complex emotions. As you get to 4-year-olds, etc., you can begin to add more emotions, but always start from the basic to adding more emotions on the repertoire. So happy, sad, angry, the very first visual here is a good idea. And then you begin perhaps to add the others. But in terms of resources, where do I find visuals to help me teach my child? The CSEFL website, it's a wonderful website. For those of you who do not know, it was developed by Vanderbilt University in conjunction for the Head Start program. So it was a program that came out, this website came out of that program, and it is in Spanish and in English, and it's free resources for parents and teachers, and it has a plethora of ideas and lots of free materials that you can get in there. Also, CSEFL has a book list for practicing different emotions. And what I mean by that is that I like the fact that they have a list. For example, if I want to read about characters who are experiencing anxiety, characters who are experiencing sadness, characters who are experiencing happiness, there's a variety of stories. There's an age range for it it has the name of the story and then an age range. So it's a great resource to learn how to go to the library and get those books, to bring them home or to see them online and to review those stories and share with the child about different people who experience emotions. The booksharetime.com, it's another good resource. And our Fairfax County Government Public Library has an early literacy program where you can find a lot of resources, a lot of books to learn about different types of emotions. The next part on our hierarchy would be, now that I know that I have to expand the emotional repertoire, I want to make sure that my child can understand the facial expression that's required, that comes along with that emotion, the body changes that happen when I have a certain emotion, and what does it look like, the behavioral expression, what happens with my body. So, for example, we can practice recognizing facial expressions on others, on themselves, in pictures. You can actually look at a video, a movie, whether it's cartoon or real life. You can stop that video and say, well, look, what's that boy doing? Look at his face. What do you think it looks like? Is that child happy or sad or mad? Then you can practice it on yourself, on somebody else's that you're watching in a playground. So the more you practice in your environment, the better the child will be at understanding that facial expression. The next thing that you want to do is you want to talk about the changes in your body with an emotion. What do people feel in their body when they're experiencing certain things? So for example, sometimes I feel tingling in my stomach, I feel my face getting red. Just think of that physiological experience that you can put words and help the child understand that an emotion has an effect. You can kind of tell when you're feeling because there are accompanying physiological expressions of that emotion. And then what do we do? Talk about the behavioral expression. So for example, when I get angry, not only do I feel my face getting red, but my fists perhaps are tightening up, or my shoulders are kind of getting tight. Again, helping children recognize how that emotion is coming through is very helpful on themselves and on others. I put the second step early learning curriculum there because that is one of the curriculums that we have in Fairfax County available at the kindergarten level. But it is a good curriculum. It does sometimes has activities for preschoolers. And many schools do have them. Some schools have other curriculum, but it is something helpful that addresses these kinds of steps. The next area that we want to take a look at would be the understanding of emotion levels. So sometimes I am a little sad, I just feel sad, or sometimes I'm really, really sad. So introducing the idea of a thermometer, an emotional thermometer, really helps children understand that it's not a black or white kind of thing, but rather it's a continuum of feelings. And we want to use thermometers that are appropriate for preschools. So here are two visuals or ideas that would be helpful to have. So for example, having the equate them with a traffic light. When you're in green, you're sort of okay, you feel that emotion, but you're kind of okay. Green, it's a little bit more intense, and red, it's very, very intense. So hopefully this will be helpful for you. And what I want to encourage you is that if you use something like this will be for a lot kids who are older. There's certainly on the end of first grade, you still have some visuals, which is very important for little ones. But having that many levels is a bit more complicated. And by second grade, the kids are expected to be able to read a little bit more and to understand the differences in when you're angry, you're not just angry, you can be sort of annoyed, and then different levels of that emotion. But again, this is for much older children. The next step that we want to do is we want to be able to teach children to recognize triggers. So what triggers an emotion? What may be happening? So for example, if something is hard to do, maybe that's what makes you mad, or maybe that's what makes you frustrated. Having that conversation, and perhaps for you as an adult to write a list of things that you know triggers a child, so you can use that in your conversation. These are visuals, of course. Kids, preschoolers will not know how to write or read these things, but it will be lists that would be useful for you as a teacher, as a parent, to begin to understand what triggers your child, and then to begin to, as you go about your day. So I noticed that when you can't do something, you get really frustrated. You use those words in your day-to-day life to help your child recognize the triggers. One of the next step that we need to be able to practice with our kids is their ability to stop and think. And we sometimes take that for granted. Some of our preschoolers may be very good, but for kids with self-regulation difficulties, it's kind of hard to stop and think. So having a visual sometimes really helps them and remind them, this is the sign of a stop sign, so you stop and think, and here's another visual that might be helpful. And as you're going about your day, practicing these skills with your kids, or even in the classroom, having this visual printed and you bring it up, it's sort of a reminder, oh, wait a minute, I've got to stop and think. And as a reminder, preschoolers are not going to do it right away. They need practice. But if you bring this visual, it will facilitate that practice. The next step that we want to try to do is we need to try to figure out what calming strategies will be helpful for our kids. And as we discover them, we can begin to talk to them when they're calm, to understand what calming strategies may be helpful for them. Or perhaps remember that knowledge about sensory sensitivities. If you understand what they are for your child, there may be some things that might be more appropriate for your child to try to bring in as a calming down strategy. So for example, just to be able to review a book could be a calming down strategy, to just have access to a certain type of toys, or some other kids need calming strategy as doing jumping jacks, and that's okay. But what would make your child feel better when they're experiencing an emotion, they recognize it, and they stop and they go to that calming strategy? So that's a helpful visual. But in terms of just some practical things, blowing bubbles really, really helps. Inflate a balloon can be a calming strategy. A really tight bear hug sometimes calms them down as well. There are a couple of books that are very helpful. I found them to be helpful. One is called Listen Like an Elephant or Breathe Like a Bear. Certainly practicing the reading of these books when they're calm is helpful. And sometimes when the story is memorized so they understand that, you can refer to that book, and that may be a calming strategy after they're familiar with the book. The promoting yoga is something that we see in the literature over and over again. When children have self-regulation difficulties, what really, really helps them is having access to mindfulness exercises or to yoga. And there's a lot on the internet, even from YouTube, that you can practice for preschoolers. If you introduce these ideas when they're little, the idea is that you practice them over time so that when they're older or when they're in middle school, in high school, they're going to have this as a calming strategy that really is going to help them. So I really would encourage you to take a look at those. The other part is the promoting regular exercise. We know how important it is for kids with self-regulation difficulties to have access to daily exercise. And I understand that it's particularly difficult for parents who are not very athletic. And I know it's hard, but really trying to make an effort to give your child a daily opportunity outside to exercise really helps them with those self-regulation skills. Here's a visual that hopefully you guys can find useful. The idea here will be to have a picture of your child. And if you have a picture of that emotion, whether it's your child's face, or if you found a visual and there's a happy or sad or mad face, you put it where I feel like. And then that thermometer, that level of emotion, maybe just a color, green, yellow, or red. And then the options of calming down. The idea here is that if you are practicing this skill with your child to try to teach them to recognize when they're super angry or when they're angry and what to do, that you have that visual at home. So when they are beginning to get angry, you may bring that visual and just remind them. Sometimes using words, it's not effective for us because they're getting to the point where they're going to lose control. So having that access to that visual sometimes really helps. Having it in the refrigerator, you can bring it in, or have it in the classroom as well. Both at home and in the classroom might be helpful. Again, remember, it's the practice of these skills when they're calm that is going to help promote that de-escalation when they're in that spot, when they're escalating very quickly. So how do we practice emotional regulation? And this is really by setting up artificial situations. And we want to set them up when they're calm. So for example, let's say that you are outside and you're taking a walk with the child and you're like, Danny, if you're in the playground and you want to join a group of friends and they don't let you in, what would you do? What would you feel like? What would happen to your body? How intense is that feeling? We know the trigger. If you stop and think, what would you do? Again, if you practice this day to day, it's not throughout the entire day, but whenever you have an opportunity, just in your conversations with your child, the more you practice, hopefully we'll be able to make this strategy a little bit more automatic. So we've talked about several steps, several in our hierarchical order of strategies. But one of the things that is very important when children are beginning to apply these strategies is that we need to make sure that they need to be able to problem solve appropriately. So if we want them to be successful, we need to make sure that they understand how to problem solve. And this is something that I've found that we take for granted in ourselves and in our children. So for us to understand how this works, let me talk a little bit about how does it look like for an adult. When we as adults are problem solving something, we do it very automatically, and we tend to use sort of 5 steps. First of all, we identify the problem. What's the problem? We know it, and we do it very quickly. And then we identify possible solutions. Then we quickly sort of look at the efficacy of those solutions, and then we pick the most appropriate one. We apply it, and then we evaluate how useful, how efficacious it was. And then if it didn't work, we go back to another solution, and if it did work, we learn from it. So we do this very automatically as adults. But in terms of preschoolers, I think we can focus on 3 main steps to make it simple. First of all, we teach them to identify the problem. We help them think of 2 ideas, 2 solutions, and then we choose the best one. And remember to do this when they're calm. And it may be something as silly as, for example, you're trying to go through a hallway and, oh, there's a chair in the middle. What's our problem, Anna? Oh, there's a chair in the middle. That's our problem. What can we do? We can crawl under, or we can jump over. Let's try it. Oh, it didn't work. What can we do again? Or you can say, I can pick up the chair and move it, or I can crawl under. Again, it's come up with day-to-day ideas or everyday things. So you practice that problem-solving skill wherever you are, the grocery store, grandparents' house, in the playground, wherever. Here's another visual from CSEFL. They do have this visual. If you can see, it has 4 steps to problem solving. You'll see what your child may best be able to handle, a 3-step or a 4-step, depending on how small they are. And here are also some ideas from CSEFL, that website that we talked about before, for problem solving. What are the things that you can do? Some ideas. So let's talk about some practical examples to help make this process more automatic in preschoolers. So for example, we can talk about how do we carry a search for a lost item at home, how to follow a simple recipe, perhaps, simple, how to make a craft, or perhaps how does mommy and daddy do laundry. And as the child gets better, as you can begin to see that they're able to talk to you about this problem-solving steps, then start thinking of problems within those problems. So for example, you can say, post a scenario like, what if it's dark and I'm looking for something that I lost? What can I do? What if I'm trying to make cookies and I can't have eggs? I can't find them. What do I do? One of the things that we do as parents often is to try to provide solutions for our kids because it's just natural. We all do that. But what we really want them to do is be able to be independent in their problem-solving skills. So sometimes taking a step back and say, what would you do? And if they have a silly idea, go with it and make it a game so that it's not a drill, it's not a teaching lesson that you're doing with the child, but rather it's a day-to-day kind of conversation. And the other example that I had in there was, what if we run out of glue for the craft? What can we do? That's a good problem-solving situation. Another step in our hierarchy would be that we need to practice flexibility. And how do we do that? There are a few ways that we can do that with our preschoolers. Here are some games, but I love this visual because being flexible is not just I can change easily or I can adapt, but rather our thinking process has to be flexible. We need to be able to have different solutions in my mind. So the visual I like because it's a bunch of people who are blindfolded and they're touching this big thing, but they think that it's something different. And that's really what we want to practice on our kids. So an example would be you have a tissue box and you put several items into the tissue box, and you have children pull one item at a time and tell you if that item is flexible or not flexible. So you can put things like a rock, like a rubber band, like a Lego piece, Play-Doh, or string or yarn, and you begin to introduce the idea of being flexible. You can put things on a pillowcase and put a few interesting items in it, and then have the child pull out something and tell you or demonstrate, if they have difficulties with words, what they can do, what is something different that they can do with that object. I'll give you an example. If you pull out of the pillowcase a cup, what can you do with a cup? I can drink from it. I can stack them. I can put it on my head. Different things, you're being flexible. So different things you can do with one thing. And things that you can do at home would be, for example, you can go in or out the house from a different door. We're just being flexible. You can have people in your family sit at different spots at the table. We're just being flexible. You can change spots where you put away certain items where you always put them away. We're going to be flexible and put them in a different place. You can visit a different grocery store. Those are just different ideas. Another step on our hierarchy to be able to practice with our children would be the ability to promote perspective taking. This is really important. And it's not empathy. It's not the ability to be empathic to somebody, but rather is the ability that I have as a preschooler to put myself in somebody else's shoes. So it's the ability to comprehend and take on the viewpoint of another person's thoughts, feelings, and attitudes. And that's not easy. It's harder for a 2-year-old to do, but as you practice, they get better. And as a 4 or 5-year-old preschooler, you would expect them to be able to take perspective. They won't know what take perspective mean, but you would know how to practice it. One tool that is awesome and I really like, it's the book Theory of Mind. They have it at the Resource Center. And what I like about this particular book is that they have small units and pamphlets where you can, the perspective taking is part of the Theory of Mind, where there's a lot of exercises for preschoolers to do things that you can practice at home. What does it take to be able to take perspective? It does take a lot of self-regulation and some executive functioning skills, determining how somebody else feels. I need to understand that. So that's the idea of knowing about emotions. In order for me to be able to take perspective, I need to know all those skills before. I need to be able to exercise inhibitory control. What that means is that I need to regulate my behavior in order to stop thinking about me and what I want to do, and stop and think, and then put myself in somebody else's shoes. And I need to be very flexible. And I love this visual because it's just very poignant. You put a 6 down, different people, it's going to be different from where you look at it. So that would be a very good visual on what is perspective taking. We all think differently, and the point of view of somebody else is very important to understand in order for me to adapt and regulate my emotions. Here's another resource that I find useful. It's a book. The Parent Resource Center may have it. Different libraries have it as well. And again, it's another resource for you to understand a little bit more about perspective taking. So this is some strategies for our hierarchical approach that I presented to you, but I also have some more suggestions and additional strategies that I found useful. One of them is this book called Raising an Emotionally Intelligent Child by John Gottman. It's a short book. Some of the chapters in there, I think, depending on what you like, you might be able to skip. But in some of the books, in some of the chapters, there's a lot of meat in it. And it really teaches us adults how to be able to address the emotional state of a child, recognize it, talk about it, and support them through that experience. So that has a lot to do with self-regulation skills. One of the takeaways from this book that I thought would be important to share today is something that we as parents do all the time. We do it to our peers, our adult peers, and to children. So for example, when a child is very, very sad, and you go, oh, don't be sad, it's okay. While you are meaning well, and you have the best intention when you say that. Unfortunately, what we're doing and we're not recognizing is that we are denying the experience of that emotion. And what this book tells you is really how important it is to recognize that emotion on the child, because you're teaching them it's okay to feel that way. And then hopefully you talk through how you're going to help them deal with that emotion. What I like about this also is that if you go online, they have a website that have some videos that are also helpful to do some emotional coaching. Another resource that I find very helpful is this game that you can do with your children. And this has to do with self-regulation. This requires practicing self-regulation of attention and behavior, and a little bit of emotion too. So you have a visual of where you're thinking something, and you have a visual where you're saying something. And then you pose to the child a few sentences. You can come up with others, but these are some ideas. So for example, when you're thinking, actually, if you say, "You're not my friend anymore," would you think it or would you say it? And then they can choose which one. "I need some help." Would you think it or would you say it? And practicing this skill again when they're calm makes it more automatic at the end. Another thing that I've learned in working with little preschoolers is that we as parents and as adults, we certainly want them to learn how to share. And that's very appropriate. But I find that it's easier for kids, especially the younger ones, when we use words like take turns. My turn, your turn. Of course, we want them to learn the concept of sharing. But I find in the practical terms, if you use words, well, let's take turns. His turn and my turn. And as they get older, begin to talk about sharing. But I would encourage you to use those words and stay away from the sharing until they get the turn taking, and then you begin the concept of sharing. Another idea to support self-regulation in little kids is the need for reminders. It's very, very important to remember that our little kids need a lot of reminders, and it's exhausting for us sometimes as parents, but it is super, super important, especially if we know they're going to go into a situation where you know they're going to have difficulties regulating themselves. For example, if they are about to go to a playground, and we want to remind them, remember, we need to take turns. You can have a visual for that as well, which I think really helps children. And as the child practices successfully, you want to minimize that visual, the use of that visual. But just reminders, always something that I find exceedingly helpful with preschoolers. And this other visual, I think it's also important to remember, as we're teaching children new skills, we want to be able to scaffold that skill, going from the physical one-on-one hand-over-hand assistance to little by little getting to less support so that we can help them be more independent. So hopefully this will help you have an idea of what would be best to do when you are teaching a skill, and then you are taking a step back little by little to make your child be a little bit more independent. Here are some other ideas for self-regulation. Games. Board games are very, very helpful for children to help them practice regulation of attention, behavior, and emotions. So for example, board games, because you have to practice rules. You have to follow rules. In order for your child to follow rules, they need to be able to regulate that impulsivity, that behavior. They need to be able to regulate that emotion. I'm mad about losing, or I'm super excited about winning. And regulate the attention. I need to pay attention. Who's next? Whose turn is it? So I have to sustain that attention. Flexible thinking as well in board games are very, very good. Another funny game, I think, in that we are familiar with it, would be Simon Says. So you play Simon Says, the simple one. It's very helpful. They need to pay attention to what I'm saying, to what I'm doing. And then as they are very successful at that, you can actually make it a little bit more complex, and you can have two puppets, voices, characters, whatever it may be. And then you say to your child, well, you're only going to listen to the monkey, not to the lion. And you go, Simon says, or Simon says, or you can do a different voice. And you can say, you're only going to listen to the deep voice. That's when you do something. You change it a little bit, and the child needs to pay attention to something that's different. So you're practicing that regulation of attention and that excitement too, because it's a fun game. Another thing that I find very helpful for parents to do is when you are doing a board game, you're playing board games with them, try to role play getting frustrated, getting superly excited. And so you have, two adults, grandpa and grandma helping you, or, or an older sibling. And then one of them pretends to get really upset and you get really, really mad. And then the other adult who's calm goes to your child, let's say Lizzie, what's he doing? What's going on with him? What's he feeling? Oh, look at his buddy. He seems to be really angry. What should he do? Again, practicing this through simple things that you do throughout the day, and hopefully when you're doing a board game, helps all that hierarchical approach to put in place when they're calm. So hopefully they'll use it when they're deregulated. Commercially speaking, I found these two games that you can buy yourself to practice self-regulations games at home. They were designed for that, and I found them to be really fun, particularly for 4 and 5-year-olds. They're very good. And any memory game, when you have those cards and you can turn them around, those are a great way to practice paying attention, regulation of behavior, because they need to wait for your turn. They need to remember working memory. So those are great games to also do at home to practice self-regulation. So finally, I just want to let you know that social emotional learning is happening all around you. The Virginia Department of Education, there's the website. If you go through the Early Childhood tab, there's a plethora of information with the Preschool Initiative Program and Early Childhood about what the state is doing at the early childhood level, and you'll be able to find a lot of resources in there. They also have a newsletter that you can subscribe to, and I find it to be very useful. I get a lot of resources from there. Within Fairfax County Public Schools, as you know, or maybe you didn't know, but there's a very, very big emphasis in social emotional learning starting in the early age. We have a lot of curriculums that have been made available to us. Different schools have different curriculums, but for you to be aware of what social emotional learning is, I think is important. And there's you go to our website, and within our website, you can Google social emotional learning, and you'll learn about CASEL and different things. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I really appreciate you watching this, and I hope you have found it helpful and that you have learned something. Thank you.